Job Smith is the Lawnmower Man. A man
Joe, come on, boy, let's go. Grass is waiting for you.
with the mind of a child.
Yeah, Cybo Man. He came to see me.
Cybo Man. Comics, right?
Yeah, Cybo Man.
And a doctor
Virtual reality holds a key to the evolution of the human mind.
with a vision of the future.
I have a game in my house that you might like to play. Would you like that?
Yeah. Okay.
A world where the normal course of events can suddenly turn inside out.
You realize, Dr. Angelo, that my intelligence has surpassed yours.
The imaginary becomes real,
Trying to get inside my head, Joe.
You can't hide anything from me, Dr. Angelo.
and reality
We have no idea what he's gonna do.
is all in your mind. The Lawnmower Man.
The backstory to The Lawnmower Man begins in 1975 with Stephen King. He publishes a short story called The Lawnmower Man in the May issue of a magazine called Cavalier. It is about a serial killer who is disguised as a lawn mowing service. In this case, he sets the lawnmower to run by itself, and he follows it crawling on the ground while eating grass, naked of course. He references Circe in passing and later discloses he is in the service of Pan, the Greek god, making sacrifices in his name. In 1987, a short film was directed by Jim Ganes, which mostly sticks to the same story, but this version remains mostly unknown. You can find it on YouTube. In 1992, New Line Cinema released the full-length feature, starring Pierce Brosnan, which originally had Stephen King's name in the title, but was removed due to King suing because it didn't resemble the source material at all. This is because the screenplay for Lawnmower Man was modified from an earlier screenplay called Cyber God by Brett Leonard and Gimel Everett, the film's director and producer, respectively. This is at the request of New Line Cinema, whom had acquired the license from Stephen King and wanted to use it. Early posters did end up using the phrase Stephen King's Lawnmower Man in the title, but it was later removed for the home releases. The film itself is a rather standard sci-fi horror story with one main focus: virtual reality. Virtual reality was something of a buzzword in the 90s, and this film captures the fascination around the technology and what kind of thoughts it was conjuring at the time in pop culture. To me, an example of high production version video game style presentation that was being shown in the cinema, similar to titles such as Tron and The Last Starfighter before it. This was the main draw of the film: long, impressive sequences of CGI depictions of what virtual reality could be like, featuring brain teaser-style puzzles and flying a craft through dangerous tunnels with a second player. In a large secretive lab, they strap in gyroscopes with virtual reality headsets and spin around performing activities like intelligence boosting, brain evolution, and so on. The film definitely has a Twilight Zone feeling to it, like a cautionary tale, as everything spirals out of control. Here is the summary of the plot. We meet Dr. Angelo, who is working for a shady group called The Shop, to develop a drug and virtual reality regimen that can be used to prepare chimps to be deployed into combat. When his star chimp, Roscoe, attempts to escape and is killed, it sends Dr. Angelo into a cycle of doubt, as his wife leaves him because he won't give up on the virtual reality gig. This leads him to ask a local special needs man named Job, affectionately known as the Lawnmower Man, if he wants to undergo experiments that can possibly raise his intelligence. Job agrees and ends up becoming more smart than Dr. Angelo himself. The Shop secretly changes the formula to raise Job's aggression along with his cognitive abilities, and this results in Job becoming far more powerful thanks to his psychic abilities, taking revenge on individuals whom had wronged him in the past. It all comes to a head when Job seeks to abandon his body to attempt to become pure energy and connect to the internet. The Shop tries to send agents after him who are molecularly dismantled by Job due to his high intelligence and psychic powers. Dr. Angelo ends up jumping into the VR world to try and prevent Job from entering the global network. He thinks he prevents Job from entering the network, but later, at the end of the movie, we discover that Job awakens, causing phone lines to ring simultaneously all at once around the world. And it's implied that this is the beginning of the next World War. Of course, it goes way over the top with the usual cliches. Scientists driven too far with a lack of morality, technology acting as a mystical, uncontrollable force, a downtrodden protagonist who becomes the bad guy. It's all quite predictable, but it still manages to be enjoyable in a quintessential 90s blockbuster kind of way. Watching it today, I still think the virtual reality scenes are the best part, and stand as a prime example of early 90s CGI that was oh so trippy and weird. I was sold on the idea of virtual reality as a kid. I used to go to a place called Virtual World in the 90s, and I remember seeing the kiosks where you could play Dactyl Nightmare in malls. I was fascinated by it and really wanted to know more. Our idea of virtual reality, of course, is much different now, and it's interesting to contrast to the way it's presented in the movie. The film did moderately well, and warranted a terrible sequel, as well as a game that saw release on multiple systems, from Game Boy to Super Nintendo, and even Sega CD as well as DOS. It was handled by SCI, known as Sales Curve Interactive, aka the Sales Curve, and published by Storm in the European Union, Time Warner North America, and Coconuts in Japan. So let's take a look at those, starting with the best version of the game, Super Nintendo version. First impressions of this game are pretty good for a licensed title. The opening music is mysterious and foreboding, while we see a summary of the movie's plot. The game takes place during the events of the film, and actually continues after where the film leaves off. And strangely enough, Dr. Angelo ends up teaming up with Job to fight a mysterious agent from the shop known as the Doom Player as the final boss. So, Dr. Angelo and Carla Parquet, whom is the mother of Job's kid buddy from the movie, must battle through this collapsing world to find and stop Job and the Doom Player. It's simultaneous two-player co-op, or single player. And the one thing I want to start off mentioning is the heads-up display, which follows a common layout style but is filled with so much strange details. The first things you notice after your life counter and points is the icons at the bottom of the screen, as well as the animated notice window that plays different contextual information. The icons will light up in certain situations, and the notice window will constantly update with information, as well as Job getting angry and yelling when you collect items. This appearance really stood out to me as a kid, and I still think it's pretty funny how it's set up. It's not particularly useful aside from your lives and multiplier points, though it is kind of interesting. With the gameplay, we get a combination of run and gun and side-scroller action, first-person or third-person VR stages that sometimes reference scenes from the film. It's easy to die quickly since you only have a single hit to get killed. Your character has a unique gun that can be powered up with various shot types and also use a charge shot by holding the R trigger, or the A button. You can only shoot straight ahead and not up and down or diagonal, like similar to Turrican. By destroying crates and various objects like toxic waste cans, you can reveal various objects like CDs that will allow you to gain a VR suit that will grant you an extra hit. Other pickups include a brief shield to keep you invincible, a bomb, and multipliers. Look for these terminals hidden throughout the levels to get a bunch of multiplier up points and extra lives that make the game much easier to get through. These terminals feature a puzzle minigame based on a scene where Dr. Angelo is having Job complete some brain training puzzles. This is a motif through all the games in which the puzzles are either too simple or completely bizarre and seemingly nonsensical. So you start off facing combat monkeys with VR gear on and armed with guns, as well as agents of the shop. As you go further in the game, enemies get more varied. Jetpack soldiers, giant bees, robots, inanimate objects like gas pumps and chairs, coke machines, so on. The one I probably hate the most is the scientist guy who uses a shield and is armed with a powerful laser. You have to really time it carefully. The side-scrolling levels are fairly well done, with some variety to the backgrounds and interesting maps, where there is room for exploration that is usually rewarded. They take place in the suburban neighborhoods, the lab where Dr. Angelo works, and finally at the internal offices of the shop. There's even a single driving stage that functions like a shoot-'em-up game, a reminiscent of Sideways' version of Spy Hunter. The VR stages have a few different types: first-person flying through obstacles, first-person combat zones, cyber run, and cyber tube. The combat zones have a distinct feel of the scene from the beginning of the film with the chimp. The cyber run and cyber tube levels are inspired by the game Dr. Angelo has at his house in the film, and is the most impressive part of the VR stages in my opinion. The controls work pretty well here for the most part, and they serve well to break up the side-scrolling stages. There is another couple boss fights in VR as well. One scene where you must fight Job in a third-person view a la Space Harrier. Here you must defeat Job's angry face, then flying into hexagon grid behind him, aiming for the green spots, which will block Job from escaping. The final level is another VR boss fight that is very tricky to get through thanks to some wonky controls. Overall, this is a disappointing finale to the game. Growing up playing this game probably makes me see it with a bit of nostalgia, but if you haven't checked it out, you may be pleasantly surprised. And that brings us to the Sega Genesis version. It's based on the Super Nintendo game. It uses the same side-scroller action levels with VR stages in between, but there is quite a few changes made, what amounts to less content overall, in my opinion. You still have both characters to choose from, but they control a bit differently from the Super Nintendo game, and it can feel clunky and unresponsive at times. The side-scroller levels seem quite a bit harder now. The vehicles and enemies you encounter move faster and they engage in tougher patterns to dodge. Boss fights like Fire Job and the chopper on the lab roof get extremely cheap because you don't have enough time to react. The first-person VR stages look pretty good here. They move along at a fast pace. They play out much longer here, like an extended version of each VR minigame from the Super Nintendo version. You can now take more than one hit in all the VR levels. This can be good or bad depending on if you enjoy these parts of the game. The combat zones seem to drag on too much. Meanwhile, the cyber run feels like a slog compared to the gorgeous graphics in the Super Nintendo game. The cyber tube still holds up well, but overall there are stages that are missing from this game, including the driving level. The transitions from stage to stage feel different. The game even starts out in a VR world without any context. Not that it made a lot of sense in the Super Nintendo version, but it just seems to flow a lot better there. With that kind of standard Western developed use of the Genesis sound chip, you get a less than ideal quality audio experience in the game. There's less depth to the music overall and lots of crackling audio. More of those badly compressed audio samples that were common on the Sega Genesis. I would say this is not really a bad game at all, but if you compare it to the Super Nintendo version, it just feels lacking. It is pretty interesting to see how they handled the differences of the hardware to best suit the VR levels. Now for the strangest game of the bunch, the Sega CD and PC version.
Of a subject to tap into the immense powers of even an ape's primitive brain. Ready. Turn left. Pull.
These versions of the game are truly bizarre. They have the approach of a standard FMV game where you have to input simple commands at the right time to get past each scene. Thing is, most of these scenes are difficult to understand what's going on and what you need to do. It's a game where you must consult the manual, and there isn't any game facts, although you can watch some playthroughs online. Probably most puzzling thing about the game is what happens in the story. You play as Dr. Angelo trapped in VR this time by Job. Job has created several challenges for you to complete, from flying through cyber tunnels, running and jumping along a conveyor belt, to what else? Those pesky puzzle minigames again.
Fantastic weapon.
Job also traps several other characters from the movie in VR with you. The priest who gets lit on fire, the bully at the gas station, and even the monkey Roscoe who died at the beginning of the film. What plays out on screen is more of a confusing mess than anything else. I can see the idea of where they're going, but the game is really the pinnacle of bad FMV at its core, unfortunately. There is a ton of really odd looking FMV to watch in this game. Couple that with the strange plot and you get one bad trip. The game was printed in low qualities and it's fairly pricey on the Sega CD. It actually had a sequel called Cyber War, which is similar to the Japanese name, which is called Virtual War for the movie and the game. Now, this game, Cyber War, had releases on DOS, Mac, and PS1 in Japan only. Similarly, it's comprised of FMV scenes with minimal interaction from the player. Although I haven't played it, it was received poorly, just like this game. There also is a Game Boy version released, and it's mostly the same as the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, just downscaled for that system. Overall, I recommend the movie and the SNES game for the full Lawnmower Man experience. They provide some interesting perspective into the 90s aesthetic and sci-fi trends. They still hold up fairly well in my opinion, if at least more than a curiosity in the history of VR films in popular culture.
Different games. I even have one that could help make you smarter.
Alright, and that's going to wrap it up for today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate everything, and I hope you have a good one.